Let's now look at the banking system in our economy and the effects that that banking system has on the money supply. An interesting feature of the banks and the way they behave is that they have a fractional reserve banking system. By a fractional reserve banking system, we mean that the reserves that they hold in cash only have to be a fraction of the total reserves that they would need, or the total deposits that are deposited in the bank. This seems quite strange. We can deposit, say, 100 Rand into a bank, and they don't need to keep that 100 Rand available. They only need to keep a fraction of that money available, and then when people come to draw money, they will use all different types of money to let you have that cash. So the banks can, in effect, create money out of nothing. By doing this, let's imagine you go into a bank, you give them 100 Rand, and the reserve requirement is the amount of reserves that they need to hold in cash so that they can give you money. The reserve requirement, let's say, is 10%. So you go into a bank, give them 100 Rand, they only have to keep 10% of that money. So they can keep 10 Rand, and the rest of the 90 Rand they can lend out to people in the economy. So they've already created a whole lot more money just by you depositing 100 Rand into the bank. This is how the fractional reserve banking system creates money out of what seems to be nothing. The reserve requirement is equal to the amount of cash that they need to hold in reserves divided by their checkable deposit liabilities. So if their liabilities were 1,000 Rand and the reserve requirement was 5%, they would only need to hold 50 Rand in actual cash, and the rest they can loan out to money in the economy. They can loan out to all sorts of individuals and businesses. The strange thing is, those businesses might then put that money that they've loaned out back into that bank. And if that bank can then hold only a proportion of that and lend out even more. So they can carry on lending out more and more money and creating more and more money in the money supply system in the economy. So that's the fractional reserve banking system, when we can calculate their excess reserves by looking at their actual reserves minus the required reserve ratio, minus the required reserve that they have in the bank. So this is a problem in the banking system. If you're only holding 10% of what money the people put with you, people could come to the bank and suddenly say, oh, well, I want my money back. And the bank will only be holding, say, 10% of all the deposits and the liabilities that they have available. So that is what happened a few years ago with Sambo Bank. Sambo Bank, a rumor went round that one of the main clients was going to withdraw a whole lot of money from the bank. And so a whole lot of people had a rush on the bank. They believed that there wouldn't be enough money for them to get their cash. So all the people who had accounts at Sambo went to the bank, tried to draw money, but then because everybody went to the bank and they had a very small reserve requirement of, say, 6%, Sambo didn't have any money left. So they tried to draw this money, but they couldn't get any of it back. And so the bank crashed and the bank collapsed, and it was a disaster for the economic system in the country. That's why banks are highly regulated by the Reserve Bank. The Reserve Bank tells them what the required reserve ratio is, how much money that they will be allowed to lend out, how much money they have to keep in reserves, and they check that at the end of every single day that the reserves in the banks are up to standard. So the banking system is highly regulated from the Reserve Bank because of these bank panics and financial panics. It's seen as a self-fulfilling prophecy. If everybody gave money to the bank and the banks kept their 10% of what everybody had given them and lent out the rest, the self-fulfilling prophecy is that if you think that there's going to be a financial crisis in the bank and you think the bank won't be able to get you money, and everybody thinks that and everybody rushes on the bank, then the banks won't be able to supply that money. Whereas if everybody just relaxed and didn't worry about it, then it would be fine. So the Reserve Bank is seen as a guarantor of the banks in the system. The Reserve Bank is the people that the banks will step back and say, okay, well, the Reserve Bank can bail us out of the situation. So the Reserve Bank has a huge amount of currency and a huge amount of cash at its disposal, and they stand behind the banks and say, don't worry, we will support you. And that creates confidence in the banking system. Now, in terms of working out this required reserve ratio, and in terms of how much checkable deposit liabilities a bank has, how much they can give out to an economy, how much extra money supply they can create, the best way that we can do this is through an example. So let's go and try to do that.